Mario Mancuso joins us now. He's a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations and Combating Terrorism under the Bush administration. Also a combat veteran of Operation Iraqi Freedom and now a partner at the Fried Frank law firm. Mario Mancuso, thanks for joining us today.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Good morning.
Well, good morning, and we've been having this conversation about Ukraine, of course, and the fact that, well, listen, I can tell you what the president said just yesterday. This is a news interview that he had with a TV station
NB7 in San
down
Diego.
in San Diego. Here's what he said.
Militarily in Ukraine as possible.
We are not going to be getting into a military excursion in Ukraine.
We will not be getting into it. And I mean, they've been saying it, and whenever anything pops up, it seems like the first thing that this administration says is, well, no one's talking about using the military, we're not going to use the military. Well, how is that helping our diplomatic efforts? Don't we have to have some threat of military intervention at some point for our diplomatic efforts to succeed?
You know, we have to have something, but more important than anything else, more important than sanctions, more important than military forces, that you have to have credibility. And I think this administration's problem, 6 years into the administration, that it has no credibility on the international stage. And that's a real problem. And that's what principally reduces our options. It's probably the right answer that, you know, Crimea is vitally important to Russia. It's
yes.
not so important to the United States. But what is important to the United States and to Europe is that Eastern Europe does not reignite itself as a frontier that is being challenged by East and West, which would introduce a great amount of instability. It's the last thing we need, and that's why credibility is really important.
Sure. And you know what else is important is our relationships with nations when we go out on these diplomatic excursions. Now, Mario Mancuso, you're a terrorism guy, and back in 2005, it probably seemed like a good idea for then Senator Barack Obama and Senator Richard Lugar to go to Ukraine, talk them into destroying their conventional weapons, because at the time we didn't want them to fall into the hands of terrorists. But when we ask them to do that, doesn't that imply a certain level of protection? We got your back. You don't need these weapons. We'll protect you if anything happens.
In that particular case, it doesn't just imply it. That's what, in fact, was said. One of the bargains for Ukraine giving up its nuclear weapons was that we would protect, we meaning the international community, would including the United States, would respect its territorial integrity. That clearly hasn't happened. And I'm telling you, our allies in Eastern and Central Europe are watching this very closely. And in particular, Poland is watching this very closely, and the Baltic republics. Thus far, the Russian adventure in Crimea and Moldova and Georgia of several years ago, those incursions have been in countries that are not NATO members. They're problematic, deeply troubling for obviously the people who live in those countries, but they don't really threaten the United States in the way that this frankly more significant incursion does. But if Russia moves into eastern Ukraine, if Russia, and it's already started making noises by using the principle of defending its co-ethnics in different parts of Europe, starts to look at other places, that's a big deal. That's a game changer. And frankly, the United States and this administration needs to realize that.
What is the impact on the days leading up to this action by Russia when you see the President of the United States and this administration out talking about how we in America need to cut back our defense spending?
I've got nature abhors a vacuum, okay? And one of the interesting stories of the past decade in Russia is that since about 2006, Russia has sensed, first it's been rich on high commodity prices. It's sensed that the United States has been largely strategically distracted. It's essentially defeated the secessionist movement in Chechnya. Now, there's still danger in Chechnya, but in a political sense, that is defeated. Russia is feeling its oats, and it's reasserting itself, and it has for 10 years. And the Obama administration, most recently the Obama administration, just hasn't recognized this. I think that's a problem. I think the defense budget cuts make it worse. The reality is the rest of the world looks to the United States because of our unique interests, our unique profile. And when we're not there, other actors step in. And when other actors step in, it's in nobody's interest, including especially the United States.
Is there some strategic advantage to being a president who is sort of a question mark in the eyes of the Russians? I mean, don't you want to be in a situation where it's not very clear what you might do, that you just might do something with your military if you're provoked in a way?
You're absolutely right. You know, we can say what we want about Putin. Putin's probably not a very good strategist. I mean, I think he's probably a decent strategist. I think he's a very good tactician. But he leaves you guessing. And
our side doesn't.
And our side doesn't. So on the one hand, we have the worst of all worlds, frankly. We have an administration, and I'm not here. I mean, I did serve in the Bush administration, and by no means were we perfect, okay? But I think President Bush did, on balance, a terrific job. I think this administration, in terms of foreign affairs, has been, frankly, a disaster. So we have been telegraphing our moves internationally. Simultaneously, we have been taking options off the table. And so that's never a good thing. And we tend to assume that our adversaries or our strategic competitors around the rest of the world approach international negotiations the way we do. And frankly, they don't. The likes of Russia and China will eat our lunch. And so I think we have to be, frankly, smarter, and we have to be mindful that not everyone negotiates on the international stage the way the U.S. does. And we have to meet those adversaries, those competitors, on the terrain that they recognize in order to advance our interests and protect our interests.
When all they've got is borscht and pickled herring, you can't blame them for wanting to eat our lunch. But Mario Mancuso is our guest. He's the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations and Combating Terrorism. And the latest news on this Russian adventure in the Crimean Peninsula, Mario Mancuso, is that Angela Merkel today said that the European Union is going to impose more sanctions, and they're suspending the G8 meetings until the political situation changes. That's just about an hour ago that was announced. One of the reasons why Vladimir Putin seemed safe in doing what he did in Crimea was because he knew that Europe needs his oil and needs his gas. What can we do to offset that dependency they have on Russia?
Okay, conceptually, I think there are two things. We have to punish, I think, in my view, we have to punish Russia for what it has already done, and then we have to deter future aggression. Some of the things we can do, sanctions are really important, but thus far in the United States, 11 individuals have been sanctioned. Okay, that's not going to work. In fact, after the president announced the sanctions, the markets rose in Russia, so clearly they're not taking it seriously.
Yeah.
So economic actors close to President Putin need to be sanctioned. There needs to be a real cost. And thus far, there is no cost. So sanctions are important. Obviously, preventing Putin an international stage in the G8 meetings, et cetera, things of that nature are really important. They're highly symbolic, but that's what he wants. We should also take steps to bolster eastern and the other parts of southern Ukraine outside of Crimea, economically, politically. The government in Kiev has started to make the right moves with respect to making noises about more autonomy. That's an important thing. Doing all that we can do with our European allies and demonstrating that the rest of Ukraine that isn't within Russia's orbit can do fantastically well is going to be an important lesson and probably the most important thing we can do.
Mario Mancuso, always good to have you. We got to leave it
Thank
there.
you, sir.
Thanks for joining us.